The gunshot echoed across the snow-capped Sierra Nevada, startling Grace Kellerman awake from her fitful slumber beneath the shelter of a wind-battered pine. She scrambled to her feet, clutching her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as the bitter December wind of 1876 cut through her like a knife. Had they found her already? Impossible, she'd covered her tracks too well after fleeing Sacramento 3 days ago. Grace squinted through the swirling snow, her breath forming clouds in the frigid mountain air. The storm had descended without warning, transforming her desperate journey toward Pioche, Nevada, into a battle for survival. Her horse had gone lame yesterday, forcing her to continue on foot up the treacherous mountain pass that separated California from Nevada territory. Now, as the temperature plummeted with the setting sun, she realized her miscalculation might cost her life. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs as she staggered forward, her boots sinking into the deepening snow. The wind howled, drowning out whatever sounds might guide her to safety. Her fingers had long since lost feeling, and the violent shivers racking her body were becoming harder to control. "Hello," she called, her voice thin and weak against the storm's fury. "Is anyone there?" Only the wind answered, mocking her with its relentless assault. Grace pressed on, each step more difficult than the last. Darkness crept in from all sides, and with it came a dangerous warmth spreading through her limbs, the deceptive comfort of freezing to death. Just as her knees buckled beneath her, a shape materialized from the white void, a man on horseback, rifle in hand. Grace tried to focus on the approaching figure, but her vision blurred as exhaustion claimed her. She collapsed into the snow, consciousness slipping away. Miss, can you hear me?" Rough hands turned her over, and Grace found herself staring up into the weathered face of a man with storm-gray eyes and a snow-dusted beard. He wore a battered Stetson and a heavy sheepskin coat. I'm lost," she managed through chattering teeth. "You're half frozen is what you are," he replied, his voice deep and graveled. "What in God's name are you doing out here alone?" Grace couldn't answer. Her eyes fluttered closed as the stranger cursed under his breath. No, stay with me now." His tone softened as he shook her gently. "What's your name?" Grace," she whispered. "Well, Grace, I'm Garrett Greenwood." In one fluid motion, he shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her trembling form. The sudden warmth was so shocking it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "We need to get you somewhere safe before this storm worsens." "I can't," she began, but he cut her off. "You can and you will." He lifted her effortlessly onto his horse, then mounted behind her, one strong arm securing her against his chest. "We'll make it together." The snow fell heavier now, and Grace leaned back against the stranger's solid warmth. His coat smelled of tobacco and horse and something indefinably masculine. As they rode through the blinding white, she felt herself drifting again, but the cowboy's voice kept pulling her back. "Stay awake, Grace. Talk to me. Where were you headed before this storm caught you?" "Pioche," she mumbled. "I have family there." It wasn't entirely a lie. Her aunt had lived in Pioche years ago, though Grace had no idea if she remained there. What mattered was getting far away from Sacramento and the powerful man who'd threatened to destroy her. Pioche. That's still 2 days' hard ride in good weather. Garrett's breath was warm against her ear. "My cabin's about an hour from here. We'll wait out the storm there." Grace wanted to protest, to explain that she couldn't delay, but exhaustion and cold had stripped away her resistance. She nodded weakly, surrendering to the circumstances and the strange cowboy's protection. The journey to Garrett's cabin passed in a blur of swirling snow and numbing cold. Despite his coat, the freezing temperatures seeped into Grace's bones. She drifted in and out of awareness, anchored only by Garrett's steady presence behind her and his occasional words of encouragement. "Stay with me, Miss Grace. Cabin's just ahead." Through half-closed eyes, she caught glimpses of a small structure emerging from the white void, a simple log cabin nestled against the mountainside, smoke curling from its chimney. Relief flooded through her as Garrett guided the horse to a small attached stable. "Can you stand?" he asked as he dismounted, reaching up to help her down. Grace nodded, but her legs betrayed her as soon as her feet touched the ground. Garrett caught her before she fell, scooping her into his arms with surprising gentleness for such a rugged man. "I've got you," he murmured, carrying her toward the cabin door. "Been hunting when the storm blew in. Lucky I found you when I did." Lucky indeed, Grace thought hazily, or perhaps Providence. Either way, she was alive because of this stranger's intervention. The cabin's interior was blessedly warm, heated by a stone fireplace where flames danced merrily. It was a bachelor's dwelling, Spartan but tidy, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a small kitchenette, shelves lined with provisions, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. Various pelts adorned the floors and walls, and a rifle rack held several well-maintained firearms. Garrett set her down in a chair near the fire, then busied himself stoking the flames. "You need dry clothes and something hot inside you," he said without looking at her. "I'll fix some coffee while you change." He pulled a worn trunk from beneath his bed and extracted a flannel shirt and woolen trousers that would swallow her whole. Not exactly ladies' fashion, but they're clean and dry. Grace clutched the offered clothing, suddenly acutely aware of her vulnerability. She was alone in a remote cabin with a man she'd just met, a situation her mother had warned against countless times. Garrett seemed to read her thoughts. "I'll wait outside while you change," he said, his expression solemn. "You have my word as a gentleman that you're safe here, Miss Grace." Something in his eyes, a steadiness, an honor that seemed as natural to him as breathing, made her believe him. She nodded, and he stepped outside despite the raging blizzard, pulling the door firmly shut behind him. Grace changed quickly, her frozen fingers fumbling with buttons and ties. The clothes engulfed her slender frame, but they were blessedly warm and smelled of pine soap. She rolled up the sleeves and pant legs, then wrapped herself in a blanket from the bed for good measure. "You can come in," she called, and immediately the door opened, bringing a swirl of snow and Garrett's imposing figure back into the cabin. He stomped his boots and hung his hat on a peg by the door. Without his coat, which she still wore over his borrowed clothes, she could better see his build, tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean musculature of a man who lived by physical labor. His dark hair was flecked with silver at the temples, suggesting he was in his mid-30s, perhaps a decade older than her 23 years. "You look better already," he commented, moving to the small stove where a pot of coffee was beginning to percolate. "Got some color back in your cheeks." "Thank you for saving my life," Grace said, her voice stronger now. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Garrett's expression darkened. "I know exactly what would have happened, seen it before in these mountains. They're beautiful but unforgiving." He poured coffee into a tin mug and handed it to her. "Drink this. It'll help warm you from the inside." Grace accepted the mug gratefully, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. "Do you live here alone?" "Just me and Thunder, that's my horse." He settled into the chair opposite her, stretching his long legs toward the fire. "Been that way 5 years now. It's very isolated." "That's rather the point," he replied with a hint of a smile that transformed his weathered face. "Some men prefer solitude." Grace sipped her coffee, studying him over the rim of her mug. There was a story there. She sensed a reason why this man had chosen a life apart from others. "What about you, Miss Grace? What brings a young woman alone to a mountain pass in December?" His tone was conversational, but his eyes were shrewd. "Family in Pioche, you said." "My aunt," she replied, sticking to her half-truth. "I'm starting fresh, running from something more like." When she stiffened, he added, "No need to tell me what, we've all got our ghosts." The coffee warmed her, and the fire's heat gradually thawed her frozen extremities. As feeling returned to her toes and fingers, so did the pain, sharp and stinging. She winced, flexing her hands. Garrett noticed immediately. "Let me see your hands." Reluctantly, she extended them. He took them in his much larger ones, turning them gently to examine her reddened fingers. His touch was surprisingly tender for hands so calloused and strong. No frostbite, thank God, just some mild cold exposure. He released her hands and stood. "I'll make something to eat." "You need to rebuild your strength." "I can help," Grace offered, attempting to rise, but Garrett gestured for her to remain seated. "Rest. You've had a rough day." He moved to the kitchenette with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to caring for himself. "I'm no chef, but I can manage a decent stew." Grace watched as he worked, efficiently cutting dried meat and vegetables into a pot already hanging over the fire. There was an economy to his movements, a purposefulness that she found oddly compelling. This was a man who wasted nothing, not energy, not words, not emotion. "Have you lived in these mountains long?" she asked, drawing the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Born in Kentucky," he replied, not looking up from his work. "Came west after the war. Tried my hand at prospecting, ranching, even marshaling for a spell in Arizona Territory." He shrugged. "Found I prefer the quiet life." "You were a lawman." Grace couldn't keep the alarm from her voice. Now he did look up, his expression unreadable. "For 3 years in Tucson." "Does that trouble you?" Grace shook her head quickly, too quickly, she realized. "No, of course not. It's admirable work." Garrett studied her for a long moment, then returned to his cooking. "It can be. It can also show you the worst of humanity, sometimes both at once." They lapsed into silence as the stew simmered and the storm raged outside. The wind howled around the cabin's corners, but inside was warmth and safety, a sharp contrast to the peril Grace had faced just hours before. Despite her wariness, exhaustion pulled at her, and she found herself fighting to keep her eyes open. "You should rest," Garrett said softly, noticing her struggle. "Take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly take your bed," Grace protested. "You can and you will," he echoed his words from earlier on the mountain. "You need proper rest to recover." Too tired to argue further, Grace moved to the narrow bed and lay down, pulling the thick quilt over her. The pillow smelled of pine and cedar, like Garrett himself. "Wake me when the stew's ready," she murmured. "If you're still sleeping, I'll keep it warm for you," he promised. Grace meant to thank him again, but sleep claimed her before the words could form. She dreamed of running through endless snow, pursued by shadowy figures with familiar voices. Just as they were about to catch her, a rider appeared, scattering her pursuers like leaves in the wind. She reached for his outstretched hand. Grace woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The cabin was dimly lit, the fire burning low in the grate. Outside, the storm continued unabated, wind shrieking and snow pelting the windows. How long had she slept? She turned to see Garrett seated at the table, cleaning a revolver by the light of a single lantern. The domestic scene struck her with unexpected force. This dangerous-looking man engaged in such a mundane task, his face softened in concentration. "You're awake," he said, setting aside his work. "Hungry?" Grace nodded, suddenly aware of the hollow feeling in her stomach. She hadn't eaten properly since leaving Sacramento. "Good. Stew's been ready for a while." He rose and ladled a generous portion into a bowl, setting it on the table along with a chunk of bread. "Come, eat while it's hot." Grace joined him at the table, conscious of his borrowed clothes and her stockinged feet. The stew was simple but hearty venison with potatoes, carrots, and wild onions, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify. After days of trail rations, it tasted like a feast. "This is delicious," she said between mouthfuls. Garrett's mouth twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. "Hunter's fare. You learn to make do with what you have. Is that what you do now, hunt, among other things?" He served himself a bowl and sat across from her. "I trap in winter, guide hunting parties in summer and fall, do some prospecting when the mood strikes me. It sounds like a very free life, free in some ways, demanding in others." He broke off a piece of bread. "The mountains don't care who you are or where you came from. They'll kill you just the same if you don't respect them." "I've learned that lesson," Grace admitted ruefully. "What exactly were you planning to do if you made it to Pioche?" Garrett asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Grace hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "Fine work, I suppose. I can read and write. I'm good with numbers. Perhaps a shop would hire me. Those are skills indeed, unusual for a woman traveling alone in such desperate circumstances." His gaze was steady. "Most women with education have family connections. I had those once." The words escaped before she could stop them. Garrett nodded slowly. "And now you don't, or at least not ones you can rely on." Grace concentrated on her stew, unwilling to elaborate. After a moment, Garrett changed the subject. "Storm's not letting up. Might be here 2-3 days from the sound of it." Grace's spoon clattered against her bowl. "3 days. But I need to reach Pioche as soon as possible." "No one's reaching anywhere in this weather," Garrett stated firmly. "Even if we could navigate the pass, the trail down the other side would be suicide in these conditions." Reality settled over Grace like a heavy blanket. She was stranded here with this stranger, dependent on his hospitality and protection. The thought should have terrified her, yet oddly, it didn't. Despite his rugged appearance and obvious capability for violence evidenced by the weapons displayed throughout the cabin, Garrett Greenwood had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. "I'm imposing on your hospitality," she said quietly. "You're not imposing if you're invited," he countered. "Besides, what kind of man would I be if I turned you out in a blizzard? There are many kinds of men in this world, Mr. Greenwood. Not all of them are good." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, of the weight behind her words. "That's true enough. But you don't need to fear me, Miss Grace. Whatever you're running from, it won't find you here." His perception unsettled her. "What makes you think I'm running?" Garrett set down his spoon, giving her his full attention. 23 years as a frontiersman, 3 as a lawman. I know fear when I see it. You're watching the door like you expect trouble to walk through it any minute." Grace felt exposed, as if he could read her thoughts. "You're very observant. Comes with the territory." He paused. "Whatever your trouble is, it won't follow you through that pass for at least 3 days. Maybe by then you'll trust me enough to tell me what we're dealing with." "We," she echoed, surprised. "I found you half dead on my mountain, Miss Grace. Like it or not, your troubles became partly mine in that moment." His words, spoken so matter-of-factly, brought an unexpected lump to Grace's throat. How long had it been since anyone had offered her help without conditions or ulterior motives? "Thank you," she whispered, unable to say more without risking tears. Garrett seemed to understand. He nodded once, then rose to clear their empty bowls. "You should get more rest. Your body's been through an ordeal. What about you? I'll keep watch a while longer." He gestured toward the window, where the storm's fury was undiminished. "Make sure the fire stays fed." Grace returned to the bed, oddly comforted by the knowledge that Garrett would be awake, standing guard against both the elements and whatever unseen dangers might lurk in the night. As she drifted off, She realized that for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Morning came with muted light filtering through snow-crusted windows. Grace woke gradually, cocooned in warmth despite the chill in the air. She opened her eyes to find Garrett already awake, stoking the fire back to life. He moved quietly, obviously trying not to disturb her. "Good morning," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. He straightened, turning toward her with a small smile that softened his weathered features. "Morning." "Sleep well. Better than I have in a long time," she admitted, sitting up and combing fingers through her tangled auburn hair. "Though I feel guilty taking your bed again." "I've slept in worse places than my own floor," he assured her, moving to the stove where coffee was already brewing. "Storm's still going strong. Might even be worse than yesterday." Grace went to the window, pushing aside the rough burlap curtain. Outside was a world transformed into white chaos, visibility reduced to mere feet beyond the glass, snow accumulating in drifts that nearly reached the windowsill. "I've never seen such a blizzard," she said, awestruck by nature's raw power. "Mountain weather can turn fierce without warning. That's why traveling these passes alone in winter is." He paused, seeming to search for a diplomatic word. "Foolish," Grace supplied with a self-deprecating smile. "I was going to say dangerous, but foolish works too." He handed her a steaming mug. "Hungry?" "Yes, but please let me help this time." Garrett studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough, I've got some cornmeal, could make johnnycakes if that suits you." Together they prepared a simple breakfast, moving around the small kitchen space in a dance that quickly became comfortable. Grace mixed the cornmeal batter while Garrett fried bacon in a cast iron skillet. The domestic scene felt oddly natural, as if they'd done this many times before. "You mentioned you can read and write," Garrett said as they sat down to eat. "Were you a teacher back in?" "Wherever you're from, Sacramento," Grace supplied, deciding there was little harm in revealing that much. "And no, not a teacher. I was a bookkeeper at my father's store until he passed last year. Then I worked for another merchant until recently." Garrett nodded, accepting the partial explanation without pressing for more. "Useful skills. Pioche is growing fast with the silver boom. They'll need educated folks." "You know the town well." "Well enough. Visit couple times a year for supplies I can't hunt or make myself." He sipped his coffee. "It's a mining town, rough around the edges but decent at its core. Good place to disappear if that's what you're after." The accuracy of his assessment made Grace pause. "Is that what you did? Disappear?" Something shuddered in his expression. "In a manner of speaking." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the howling wind and the occasional pop from the fireplace. Grace found herself studying Garrett when he wasn't looking, the competent hands that had saved her life, the lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship, the way his presence filled the small cabin without being overwhelming. "We should check your clothes," he said eventually. "See if they're dry." Her traveling dress and undergarments hung near the fire, mostly dry now though still bearing the evidence of her ordeal in the mountains. Grace touched the fabric, noting the tears and soil stains. "They'll need mending," she sighed. "I've got thread and needles," Garrett offered, moving to a small chest near his bed. He returned with a surprisingly comprehensive sewing kit. "Not much for fancy stitchwork myself, but I can keep buttons attached." Grace accepted the kit gratefully. "Thank you. I'll repair these while we wait out the storm." As she worked on her clothing, Garrett busied himself with various tasks around the cabin, checking his rifles, mending a pair of snowshoes, whittling what appeared to be a small animal figure from a block of pine. They moved through the day in easy companionship, exchanging occasional conversation but comfortable in silence too. By mid-afternoon, Grace had finished mending her dress and moved on to darning one of Garrett's socks. She'd noticed had a small repayment for his kindness. He raised an eyebrow when he saw what she was doing but didn't comment beyond a gruff "thank you." As dusk approached, Garrett pulled out a battered chessboard. "Do you play?" "My father taught me," Grace replied, surprised. "Though I haven't played in years." "Might be a good way to pass the evening." He set up the pieces carved from bone and wood, clearly handmade. "Unless you'd prefer cards, chess is perfect." Grace settled across from him as he arranged the board between them. They played 3 games, with Grace winning the first to Garrett's evident surprise, and him taking the next 2 as she grew tired. Throughout their matches, they conversed more freely than before, sharing bits and pieces of their lives without delving too deeply into painful territories. Grace learned that Garrett had fought for the Union in the Civil War, joining up at 18 despite being from Kentucky, a border state with divided loyalties. He spoke little of the conflict itself, but mentioned that afterward, he'd found it difficult to settle back into normal life. The West had called to him with its promise of open spaces and new beginnings. In turn, she told him about growing up in Sacramento as the daughter of a moderately successful merchant, about her mother's death from influenza when Grace was 16, and her father's declining health in the years that followed. "He left the business to me," she explained as Garrett contemplated his next move on the chessboard. "But there were debts I didn't know about. I had to sell everything to settle them." "That's a heavy burden for a young woman alone," Garrett commented, moving his knight. "It was," Grace agreed, countering with her bishop. "But I managed. Found work with another merchant, Mr. Blackford." She hesitated, the name bringing unwelcome memories. "He was, not what he seemed at first." Garrett's eyes sharpened at her tone. "This Blackford, he's why you're running." Grace's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her queen. "Checkmate in 3 moves," she said instead of answering. Garrett studied the board, then looked back at her face. After a moment, he tipped over his king in surrender. "You're right. Well played." He began resetting the pieces. "Another game. I think I'll turn in if you don't mind," Grace said, suddenly exhausted. "Thank you for the games." "Of course." He watched her rise from the table. "Grace, whatever happened in Sacramento, you're safe here." The simple statement, delivered without pressure for details, nearly undid her. "Good night, Garrett," she managed, retreating to his bed before emotion could overcome her. That night, as the storm continued its assault on the mountain, Grace lay awake longer than she intended. Across the cabin, she could see Garrett's silhouette stretched out near the fire, one arm folded beneath his head. This strange, solitary man had saved her life, offered shelter and protection without question, and asked for nothing in return. In her experience, such kindness without expectation was vanishingly rare. What would happen when the storm cleared? Would she continue to Pioche alone, or would Garrett escort her? And why did the thought of parting from him already create a hollow feeling in her chest? They were strangers who had known each other barely 2 days, yet something about his steadfast presence felt like an anchor in the turbulent sea her life had become. These thoughts accompanied Grace into sleep, where her dreams were a confused mixture of pursuit and protection, danger and safety, with Garrett's gray eyes watching over it all. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, keeping them confined to the cabin but allowing a rhythm to develop between them. They shared cooking and chores, played chess in the evenings, and gradually revealed more of themselves through conversation. Grace found herself laughing for the first time in months at Garrett's dry observations about frontier life and his encounters with various colorful characters during his travels. By the 3rd evening, the storm had begun to wane, the wind's howl diminishing to an occasional moan. They sat before the fire after dinner, Grace mending one of Garrett's shirts while he cleaned his rifle, a comfortable domesticity that felt increasingly natural. "Should be clear enough to travel tomorrow," Garrett said, breaking a lengthy but comfortable silence. "At least to make it down to lower elevation." Grace's hands stilled on her needlework. "Oh." The single syllable conveyed her mixed feelings about this development. "I'll escort you to Pioche," he continued, focused on his task. "Too dangerous for you to attempt the crossing alone, especially with the fresh snow. I couldn't ask you to go so far out of your way." "You didn't ask, I offered." He looked up then, his expression serious. "Unless you'd prefer to go alone." "No," Grace said quickly, too quickly perhaps. "I would be grateful for your company." Garrett nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "We'll leave after sunrise. Should reach Pioche in 2 days if the trails aren't too badly drifted." The prospect of leaving the cabin's safety brought Grace's anxieties rushing back. What if Joshua Blackford had somehow traced her route? What if his men were already in Pioche, waiting? The mining town had seemed a safe destination when she was planning her escape, but now— "Garrett," she began hesitantly, setting aside her sewing. "There's something I should tell you before we go." He set down his rifle, giving her his full attention. "I'm listening." Grace took a deep breath. "The man I worked for in Sacramento, Mr. Blackford, he's a wealthy merchant with political connections. After my father died and I sold our store, he hired me as his bookkeeper." She twisted her hands in her lap. "At first he was professional, even kind. But over time his behavior changed. He began to pursue me." Garrett's expression darkened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. "I refused his advances as politely as I could. I needed the position, you see, but he became more insistent." Grace swallowed hard. "2 weeks ago, he cornered me in his office after hours. He said he'd decided to make me his wife, that it was all arranged. When I refused, he became angry." "Did he hurt you?" Garrett's voice was dangerously quiet. "He tried. I managed to escape, but not before he threatened me. He said if I wouldn't be his willingly, he'd ensure I had no choice." Her voice trembled. "He has friends in the territorial government, judges who owe him favors. He said he'd have me declared mentally unsound and committed to an asylum if I didn't comply." "Bastard," Garrett muttered. "I fled that night with what little money I had saved. Took the stage as far as Placerville, then bought a horse and supplies for the journey to Nevada." Grace looked up at him. "I believed if I could reach Pioche, I'd be beyond his reach. Nevada is a separate territory with different authorities, but now I fear he may have sent men after me." Garrett was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable as he processed her story. Finally, he asked, "Do you have any reason to believe he's tracked you this far?" "No, but he's a determined man with resources. The snowstorm may have covered my trail, but once we reach Pioche—" "Grace." Garrett leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You trust me?" The question caught her off guard. Did she trust this man she'd known only a few days? This solitary frontiersman who lived apart from society by choice? Logic said it was too soon for trust, yet every instinct told her Garrett Greenwood was a man of honor. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." He nodded, as if her answer confirmed something important. "Then trust me when I say I won't let Blackford or his men harm you. We'll reach Pioche safely, and we'll figure out what comes next when we get there." "What comes next?" Grace echoed, puzzled by his phrasing. "Your plan was to reach Pioche and find work, correct?" When she nodded, he continued, "Well, plans sometimes need adjusting based on circumstances. If Blackford is as connected as you believe, Pioche might not be far enough. But where else can I go? I have limited funds, no family, no connections." Garrett was quiet for a moment, his gaze returning to the fire. "Let's get you to Pioche first. We'll assess the situation there before making further decisions." His measured response both reassured and worried Grace. It was clear he took the threat seriously, which validated her fears, yet his calm competence suggested he believed they could navigate the danger. "Thank you for understanding," she said softly. "And for not judging me." Garrett's brow furrowed. "Why would I judge you? You did nothing wrong." "Some might say I led him on, or that I should have been flattered by the attention of such a powerful man." These were, in fact, the exact words her landlady had used when Grace had sought her help after Blackford's assault. "Some people are fools," Garrett stated flatly. "No woman owes her body or her life to any man, regardless of his position." The simplicity and certainty of his declaration brought tears to Grace's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, embarrassed by her emotional response. "We should rest," Garrett said, noticing her fatigue. "Tomorrow will be challenging enough with the fresh snow." Grace nodded and rose from her chair. "Good night, Garrett, and thank you for everything." "No need for thanks," he replied gruffly. "Get some sleep, Grace." As she settled into bed for what would be her last night in the cabin, Grace felt a curious mix of apprehension and anticipation. The journey ahead would be difficult and potentially dangerous. Yet the prospect of facing it with Garrett by her side made it seem less daunting. Whatever waited in Pioche safety or further peril, at least she wouldn't face it alone. The next morning dawned clear and brilliantly cold, the storm having swept away to reveal a pristine world of white stretching as far as the eye could see. Grace stood outside the cabin, marveling at the transformed landscape while Garrett prepared his horse and a second mount, a sturdy bay gelding she hadn't seen before. "Where did the second horse come from?" she asked, pulling Garrett's borrowed coat tighter against the biting cold. "Lean-to behind the cabin," he explained, adjusting the saddle on the bay. "Had two when I found you. Thunder here," he patted his black stallion's neck, "and Rusty, who I use as a pack horse. Figured you'd prefer riding to walking through snow drifts." Grace approached the bay, who regarded her with intelligent brown eyes. "Hello, Rusty," she said softly, stroking his velvety muzzle. "Thank you for the loan." Garrett watched her interaction with the horse, a hint of approval in his expression. "You've ridden before, I take it, since childhood." "My father believed in practical education for daughters as well as sons." Grace smiled at the memory. "He said a woman should be able to manage accounts, ride a horse, and shoot a gun if necessary. Sound philosophy." Garrett handed her a small revolver from his saddlebag. "Speaking of which, ever fired one of these?" Grace accepted the weapon, checking the cylinder with practiced ease. "Smith & Wesson Model 3. My father owned one similar." She spun the cylinder, verified it was loaded, then returned it to half-cock position. "I'm not an expert marksman, but I can hit what I aim at." Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly, whether in surprise at her knowledge or her competence. She couldn't tell. "Good. Keep it with you. Hopefully, you won't need it, but better to have it just the same." He helped her mount Rusty, then swung up onto Thunder with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. They set off down the mountain trail, Garrett leading the way through snow that reached the horse's knees in places. The journey was slow and demanding. The storm had altered familiar landmarks, covered trails, and created treacherous conditions on the steeper sections. Garrett navigated with confidence, occasionally dismounting to check their path or clear an obstacle. By midday, they descended enough that the snow was less deep, allowing faster progress. They stopped to rest the horses in a sheltered grove of pines. Garrett produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, along with a flask of coffee that had remained miraculously warm. "You're handling the trail well," he commented as they ate their simple meal. "My dress might suggest otherwise," Grace replied ruefully. gesturing at the mud-splattered hem visible beneath her borrowed coat. "Clothes can be washed. Spirit is what matters on the frontier." His gray eyes held genuine respect. "You've got plenty of that." The compliment warmed her more than the coffee. "I've had to develop it. A woman alone doesn't survive long without spirit." "True enough." Garrett's gaze drifted to the horizon, where distant mountains shimmered in the winter sunlight. "We'll make it to Miner's Rest by nightfall if we keep this pace. Small settlement at the foot of the mountains. Has a decent inn where we can get proper food and rest. And tomorrow to Pioche." Grace asked, trying to keep anxiety from her voice, if conditions allow. He studied her face. "You're worried about what we'll find there." It wasn't a question, but Grace answered anyway. "I can't help thinking about what happens after we arrive. Where will I stay? How quickly can I find work? Will Blackford's influence reach even there?" Garrett was silent for a moment. "I know people in Pioche, good people who might help, and as for immediate concerns—" He hesitated, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "I have savings, enough to see you settled properly until you find your feet." Grace stared at him, astonished by the offer. "Garrett, I couldn't possibly accept—" "It's not charity," he interrupted, his tone firm. "Consider it an investment in a capable bookkeeper. Mining towns always need people who can manage figures honestly." Before she could formulate a response, he was on his feet, packing away their meager supplies. "We should move on. Daylight's precious this time of year." They resumed their journey in thoughtful silence. As they descended further, the landscape gradually changed from pristine white to patchy snow, interspersed with exposed earth and rock. By late afternoon, they entered a narrow valley where a small cluster of buildings marked the settlement of Miner's Rest. It was a modest outpost, a general store, a smithy, a saloon, and the Promised Inn, along with a handful of cabins scattered along what passed for a main street. A few people moved about their business, pausing to watch curiously as the strangers rode in. Garrett led them directly to the inn, a two-story wooden structure with a sign depicting a pickaxe and shovel crossed over a bed. He dismounted and helped Grace down, his hands lingering briefly at her waist before he stepped back. "Wait here while I arrange for rooms," he said, tying the horses to a hitching post. Grace nodded, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance, a woman in a mud-stained dress and a man's coat, arriving with a solitary male companion. What would these strangers think of her? The inn's proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. Fleming, assessed the situation with shrewd eyes but maintained a professional demeanor as Garrett requested 2 rooms for the night. Grace was grateful for the woman's discretion, especially when she offered hot water for bathing without Grace having to ask. "Dinner's at 6 in the common room," Mrs. Fleming informed them as she showed Grace to a small but clean chamber on the 2nd floor. "Nothing fancy, but it's hot and plenty of it." "Thank you," Grace said sincerely. "That sounds wonderful." Left alone, Grace savored the luxury of a proper bath, washing away days of grime and trail dust. She put on her freshly mended dress, grateful that the worst stains were hidden by its dark blue fabric. Her auburn hair, clean and combed, she arranged in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. When she descended to the common room, she found Garrett already seated at a corner table. He'd also cleaned up, his dark hair damp from washing, his beard trimmed. He wore a clean flannel shirt and had exchanged his trail-worn pants for slightly less weathered ones. He stood as she approached, his expression warming as he took in her transformed appearance. "You look," he began, then seemed to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. "Refreshed." "As do you," she replied, taking the seat he offered. "It's amazing what hot water and soap can accomplish." Dinner was simple frontier fare venison stew, cornbread, and apple pie for dessert, but after days of trail food, it tasted like a feast. They ate with good appetite, conversation flowing easily between them. The few other diners in the common room cast occasional curious glances their way, but no one approached or questioned them. As they finished their meal, Garrett leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I've been asking discreet questions. No strangers matching the description of Blackford's men have passed through recently." Relief washed over Grace. "That's good news." "It is, but we should remain cautious. Pioche is larger with more traffic." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. "Grace, I've been thinking about your situation." Something in his tone made her heart beat faster. "Yes, Blackford is looking for a woman traveling alone, but what if you weren't alone?" His gray eyes held her steadily. "What if, when we reach Pioche, you were a married woman?" Grace stared at him, uncomprehending for a moment. "Married, but I'm not," understanding dawned. "You mean, pretend to be married?" "To you," Garrett nodded, his expression serious. "A single woman arriving in town raises questions, attracts attention. A married couple settling in is commonplace, unremarkable. But people would expect us to live together, to act as husband and wife." The idea sent a confusing mix of emotions through her: alarm, certainly, but also something less easily defined. "In appearance only," he clarified quickly. "I'd secure separate accommodations for you once it was safe. But the protection of my name, of a supposed husband who could defend you, might be enough to deter Blackford's men if they do come looking." Grace considered the proposal. It made practical sense. A married woman would have protection under the law that a single woman lacked. And the mere existence of a husband, especially one like Garrett, whose capability for violence was evident in his bearing, might be enough to make Blackford's men hesitate. Yet something about the arrangement felt hollow. "Would you stay in Pioche then, to maintain the deception?" "For a time," Garrett replied. "Long enough to establish the story, to make sure you're truly safe. And your cabin, your life in the mountains, will be there when this is over." He leaned back, watching her process the idea. "It's just a suggestion, Grace. A possible solution to consider." Before she could respond, the inn's door banged open, admitting a gust of cold air and 3 trail-worn men. They stomped snow from their boots and headed straight for the bar section of the common room, their loud voices cutting through the previously quiet atmosphere. Garrett's posture changed instantly, tension flowing into his frame as he casually shifted to better observe the newcomers. Grace followed his gaze, noting the men's expensive though travel-stained attire and the quality of their firearms. "Don't stare," Garrett murmured. "But tell me, could they be Blackford's men?" Grace forced herself to look away, focusing on her empty plate. "I don't recognize them specifically, but they have the look of the type he employs. Former soldiers turned private security. He uses them to intimidate business rivals." Garrett nodded slightly. "Finish your pie, then go upstairs. Lock your door and keep the revolver close." "What are you going to do?" "Listen, if they're just passing through, fine. If they're looking for you." His expression hardened. "I'll handle it." Fear and guilt twisted in Grace's stomach. "Garrett, I can't let you risk yourself for me. Not your decision to make." His tone softened slightly at her expression. "Grace, I brought you off that mountain. I'm not abandoning you now." The conviction in his voice silenced her protest. Grace finished her dessert quickly, then rose from the table. "Good night, then," she said, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Thank you for dinner." Garrett nodded, his eyes communicating what he couldn't say aloud. "Be careful. Stay alert." Grace ascended the stairs with measured steps, fighting the urge to look back at the strangers. In her room, she locked the door as instructed and positioned herself near the window, where she could see part of the street below while remaining hidden behind the curtain. Time crawled by. She could hear muffled voices from downstairs, but couldn't make out words. What was happening? Had the men recognized her description? Was Garrett in danger because of her? A soft knock at her door startled her from these thoughts. Grace reached for the revolver, approaching the door cautiously. "Who is it?" "It's me," came Garrett's low voice. She unlocked the door quickly, relief flooding through her at the sight of him unharmed. He slipped inside, closing and locking the door behind him. "They're Blackford's men, all right," he said without preamble. "Asking questions about a woman traveling alone, matching your description. Offering good money for information." Grace sank onto the edge of the bed, fear a cold knot in her stomach. "How did they find me so quickly?" "They didn't, not specifically. They're checking all possible routes out of California." Garrett leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "They talked about splitting up tomorrow, one heading north toward Carson City, the other two continuing to Pioche." "Then Pioche isn't safe after all," Grace whispered. "It could be, with the right precautions." Garrett's expression was thoughtful. "The men downstairs are looking for Grace Kellerman, a single woman traveling alone, not Mrs. Grace Greenwood, arriving with her husband to start a new life." The proposed deception suddenly seemed less theoretical, more urgent. "You still think we should pretend to be married?" "I think it's our best option." He pushed away from the wall, moving to sit beside her on the bed's edge, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Grace, listen to me. I know we've only known each other a short time, but I give you my word as a man of honor this arrangement would be for your protection only. I would never presume or expect anything improper." The earnestness in his face, the integrity evident in every line of his expression, moved her deeply. This man had already saved her life once. Now he was offering to upend his own existence to protect her from a danger that wasn't his responsibility. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "Why go to such lengths for a stranger?" Garrett was quiet for a moment, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Maybe because I know what it's like to run from something you can't fight alone." He looked up, meeting her eyes again. "Or maybe because in the 4 days I've known you, I've come to care what happens to you." The simple honesty of his admission caught Grace off guard. She had felt the connection between them growing, but hadn't expected him to acknowledge it so directly. "I've come to care about you too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than I should, perhaps, given the circumstances." Something flickered in his eyes' surprise, followed by a warmth that made her heart beat faster. For a moment neither spoke, the silence charged with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Garrett cleared his throat. "We should leave at first light before Blackford's men. Take the south trail to Pioche, longer but less traveled. And when we arrive as husband and wife." His expression grew serious again. "If you're willing to try this deception." Grace considered all that such an arrangement would entail: the close proximity, the necessary intimacy of their public interactions, the complex emotions already developing between them. It was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with Blackford's threats. Yet what alternative did she have? "I'm willing," she said at last. "But Garrett, you must promise me something." "Name it." "When this is over, when I'm truly safe, you'll be free to return to your life in the mountains. I won't hold you to any permanent arrangement." A shadow crossed his features, so briefly she might have imagined it. "You have my word," he said, rising from the bed. "Get some rest now. We leave before dawn." At the door he paused, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, husband," she replied, testing the word. The ghost of a smile touched his lips before he slipped out, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts and a future suddenly more complicated than she had ever imagined. True to his word, Garrett woke her before dawn. They departed Miner's Rest while the settlement still slept, taking a little-used trail that wound south before turning east toward Pioche. The day was clear but bitterly cold, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they rode. "We should reach Pioche by nightfall if we maintain this pace," Garrett said as they stopped briefly to rest the horses around midday. "Better to arrive after dark, fewer people to notice newcomers." Grace nodded, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders. The garment had become a comfort to her, its weight and scent a constant reminder of the man who had saved her. "Have you thought about where we'll stay once we reach town?" "There's a boarding house run by a widow named Martha Simmons. Decent place, clean, and Martha's not one to gossip." He handed her a strip of jerky. "I helped her son when he got in trouble with some card sharks a few years back. She'll remember me. And our story. Beyond being husband and wife, simple is best. We married in Sacramento, decided to seek opportunity in the Nevada silver boom." Garrett's expression grew thoughtful. "Your father's store, what kind of merchandise did he sell?" "Primarily dry goods and hardware." "Why?" "So you'd know that business." "We could say we're planning to open a similar establishment in Pioche." He nodded, warming to the idea. "It's a growing town. New businesses open regularly. No one would question it. And your background. A storekeeper seems quite different from a mountain man." "I'll be a former prospector who found enough silver to start a business but not enough to retire." He smiled slightly. Close enough to the truth to be believable. They continued their journey, refining their fictional history as they rode. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they had constructed a plausible narrative. Married 6 months ago after a brief courtship. Traveled east with plans to establish a store catering to the mining community. The simplicity made it easy to remember, with enough truth woven through to sound authentic. As twilight deepened into night, the lights of Pioche appeared in the distance, a sprawl of illumination against the darkness, larger than Grace had expected. The town clung to the side of a steep hill, with mines visible on the slopes above and businesses clustered along the main street below. "Impressive, isn't it?" Garrett commented, noting her expression. "Was just a small settlement until they struck silver in '69. Now there's nearly 1,000 people here." "It's larger than I imagined," Grace admitted, feeling both relief and trepidation. A town this size offered anonymity but also more potential contacts for Blackford's men. "Size works in our favor. Easier to blend in." Garrett guided them down the final approach. "Remember, from this point on, we're husband and wife. Follow my lead if anyone questions us." They entered Pioche via a side street, avoiding the busier thoroughfare with its saloons and gambling houses. The boarding house Garrett had mentioned was located in a quieter residential area, a 2-story structure with a small sign advertising clean rooms and good meals. Martha Simmons proved to be a handsome woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner. Recognition dawned in her face when she saw Garrett. "Well, I'll be Garrett Greenwood. Didn't expect to see you until spring thaw." Her gaze shifted to Grace with undisguised curiosity. "Martha, good to see you." Garrett dismounted and helped Grace down, his hand lingering at her waist in a gesture that would look natural for a husband. "This is my wife, Grace. We're hoping you might have a room available." If Martha was surprised by the news of Garrett's marriage, she hid it well. "Wife, is it? Well, congratulations to you both." She extended a work-worn hand to Grace. "Welcome to Pioche, Mrs. Greenwood." "Thank you." Grace accepted the handshake, the unfamiliar form of address sending an odd flutter through her stomach. "My husband speaks highly of your establishment. Does he now?" Martha's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Well, come in out of the cold. I've got one good room left, double bed, private washroom. Breakfast included in the rate. Garrett paid for a week in advance while Martha showed them to their room on the second floor. It was simply furnished but clean and comfortable, with a large iron bed, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner already radiating welcome heat. "Breakfast is at 7 sharp," Martha informed them as she prepared to leave. "But I'll have coffee ready by 6 for early risers." Once alone, the reality of their situation settled over them. One room, one bed, the pretense of marriage suddenly very tangible. "I'll sleep on the floor," Garrett said immediately, setting down their bags. "We'll need to maintain appearances in public, but in private, you have my word." "I know," Grace interrupted gently. "I trust you, Garrett, truly." He nodded, some tension leaving his shoulders. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow we'll need to establish ourselves in town, begin building our cover story." Grace agreed, though the prospect of sleeping so near this man who increasingly occupied her thoughts was both unsettling and strangely appealing. They established an awkward routine of taking turns using the washroom, carefully avoiding looking at each other as they prepared for sleep. Garrett made a pallet on the floor using spare blankets Martha had provided, while Grace took the bed. Despite her exhaustion from the journey, sleep proved elusive. She lay awake, listening to Garrett's deep, even breathing, wondering how this deception would unfold and where it might lead. Morning brought a fresh perspective and renewed determination. Over Martha's hearty breakfast, they discussed their plans for the day, securing business premises, opening a bank account with Garrett's savings, and beginning to establish themselves as new residents of Pioche. "We should also visit your aunt," Garrett suggested, maintaining their fiction for any listening ears. "Since she's the reason we chose Pioche specifically." Grace caught on quickly. "Yes, though I'm not certain where she's living now. It's been years since we've corresponded." "The postmaster might know," Martha offered, refilling their coffee cups. "Tom Jenkins knows everyone in town, especially the older residents." The suggestion was genuinely helpful. A visit to the local post office would be a natural step for newcomers seeking a relative, and it would allow them to introduce themselves to another respected community member. They spent the day moving purposefully through town, presenting themselves as the Greenwoods, a married couple looking to establish a dry goods business. At the bank, they opened an account. At the land office, they inquired about available commercial properties. At the post office, they asked Postmaster Jenkins about Grace's fictional aunt, supposedly named Catherine Miller, expressing disappointment when he confirmed no one by that name currently received mail in Pioche. Throughout it all, they maintained the subtle physical intimacies of a married couple. Garrett's hand at the small of Grace's back as they entered buildings, Grace straightening his collar before meeting the banker, shared glances and easy smiles that suggested comfortable familiarity. By day's end, they had successfully introduced themselves to several key community members and identified a vacant storefront on a side street that would suit their supposed business venture. More importantly, they had established their presence as an unremarkable married couple with legitimate reasons for being in Pioche. As they walked back to the boarding house in the gathering dusk, Garrett kept his voice low. "No sign of Blackford's men yet, but they'll likely arrive tomorrow if they maintain their pace." "Do you think our deception will work?" Grace asked, anxiety creeping back despite the day's successes. "It's working so far." He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You played the role of Mrs. Greenwood quite convincingly today." "As did you, Mr. Greenwood." She managed a small smile. "Who knew you could be so charming when discussing fabric inventory with Mrs. Jenkins?" "A man contains multitudes," he replied with mock seriousness, drawing a genuine laugh from Grace. That night, their routine in the room felt less awkward, the roles they'd played all day carrying over into an easier companionship. Still, as Grace lay in bed listening to Garrett shift on his makeshift pallet, she couldn't help wondering how long they could maintain this charade and whether it might eventually become something more than pretense. The following morning brought confirmation of their fears. As they breakfasted with other boarding house guests, Martha entered with news. "Two strangers in town asking questions," she reported quietly as she served more biscuits. "Came in on the Carson City Road late last night. Staying at the Silver Dollar Hotel, but they've been making the rounds of all the businesses this morning." Garrett's expression remained neutral, but Grace felt his foot press against hers under the table, a silent signal to remain calm. "What kind of questions?" he asked casually. "Looking for a woman traveling alone. Auburn hair, mid-20s, offering good money for information." Martha's shrewd eyes moved between them. "Claimed she's a runaway wife, but they don't strike me as concerned husbands." "Hope they find her," Garrett commented, buttering a biscuit with apparent unconcern. "Dangerous for a woman to travel these parts alone." Martha nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by their lack of reaction. "Well, just thought you should know. New folks in town tend to draw attention." After she moved on to serve other guests, Garrett leaned closer to Grace. "We need to be seen together in town today. Establish ourselves further. The more people who know us as a married couple, the less likely Blackford's men will connect you to the woman they're seeking." They spent the day executing this strategy, visiting more businesses, attending a church social announced at breakfast, and even putting down a small deposit on the storefront they'd viewed the previous day. Everywhere they went, they presented a united front as the Greenwoods, a devoted couple excited about their new venture in Pioche. Late in the afternoon, as they exited the general store where they'd been discussing potential suppliers, Garrett's hand suddenly tightened on Grace's arm. Following his gaze, she saw two men across the street who matched the description of Blackford's agents, well-dressed despite trail dust, with the hard eyes and watchful stance of men accustomed to violence. "Don't react," Garrett murmured. "They're watching everyone who passes. Let them see us as a couple." With deliberate casualness, he pulled her closer, his arm slipping around her waist. Grace leaned into him, tilting her face up with a smile as if responding to something he'd said. The intimate gesture would appear natural to observers, a husband and wife sharing a moment of affection. Garrett lowered his head, his lips close to her ear. "They're watching us. Laugh as if I've said something amusing." Grace complied, producing a convincing laugh while her heart raced with fear, and something else, awareness of Garrett's proximity, his breath warm against her skin. They continued down the street, maintaining their loving facade until they turned the corner toward the boarding house. Only then did Garrett's arm loosen slightly, though he didn't release her completely. "They didn't recognize you," he said quietly. "But they'll be questioning everyone in town. We need to be prepared if they approach us directly. What should we do? Continue as we have been. The longer we're established as a married couple, the less suspicious they'll be." He guided her up the boarding house steps. "And tomorrow we'll take more permanent measures." "What do you mean?" Garrett stopped at the door to their room, his expression serious. "I mean we should make our marriage official on paper at least. The town has a justice of the peace. A real marriage license would cement our story beyond question." Grace stared at him, momentarily speechless. A real marriage, even if only for protection, was far beyond the deception they'd initially discussed. "Garrett, that would be a legal commitment, not just a pretense." I know. His gray eyes held her steadily. But it would also provide you with legal protections that our current arrangement doesn't. If something happened to me, you'd have rights to our joint accounts, the business property we've leased. And most importantly, it would make it nearly impossible for Blackford to claim you as his runaway fiancé or whatever lie he's constructed. The practical considerations were compelling, yet Grace hesitated. And when this is over, when I'm truly safe, as I promised before, you'll be free to go your own way. We can seek an annulment or divorce in time, claiming irreconcilable differences. His expression softened slightly. I'm not asking for anything beyond what we've already established, Grace. Just a document that provides you with additional security. She considered his proposal, weighing the implications. A real marriage, even a temporary one, was not something she'd ever envisioned entering into as a matter of convenience. Yet the danger from Blackford was real, and Garrett's reasoning sound. More than that, in the week since he'd found her freezing on the mountain pass, Garrett Greenwood had proven himself to be a man of integrity, compassion, and unwavering protection. If she had to legally bind herself to someone for safety, she could do far worse. "All right," she said finally. "If you believe it's necessary, I'll agree to a legal marriage." Relief flickered across his features. "We'll see Justice Parker first thing tomorrow." He unlocked their door, then paused. "Grace, I want you to know I don't take this commitment lightly, even understanding its temporary nature." "Nor do I," she replied softly. "Thank you, Garrett, for everything you've done." That night, as they prepared for sleep in what had become their routine, Grace found herself studying Garrett with new eyes, this man who would soon be her husband-in-law, if not in fact. He moved with the quiet efficiency she'd come to associate with him, his actions deliberate and controlled. Yet there was gentleness too, evident in how he carefully folded her shawl when she set it aside, in the way he always ensured she had the warmer side of the room near the stove. "Garrett," she said as he prepared his pallet on the floor, "may I ask you something personal?" He straightened, regarding her with slight wariness. "Of course. You've never married before, have you? In reality, I mean." "No." He sat on the edge of his makeshift bed. "Came close once, years ago in Arizona. Elizabeth was her name, daughter of a rancher outside Tucson." "What happened?" Grace asked gently. Garrett was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "I was still marshalling then. Made enemies of a gang I'd helped break up. They couldn't get to me directly, so they went after her." His voice hardened. "She survived, but her father decided a lawman's wife would always be in danger. Sent her back east to relatives." "I'm sorry." "It was for the best," he said, though his tone suggested he might not entirely believe it. "Taught me that my kind of life doesn't leave room for family." He looked up at her, his expression softening. "Until now, I suppose." The implication that she had somehow altered his solitary path created a warmth in Grace's chest that had nothing to do with the stove's heat. "Good night, Garrett," she said softly. "Good night, Grace." The next morning, they presented themselves at Justice Parker's office, a small room attached to the town hall. The justice was a balding man with spectacles and a genial manner who seemed delighted to perform a wedding ceremony, however simple. "Not often I get to unite folks who have actually chosen each other," he commented as he prepared the necessary documents. "Most marriages I perform are shotgun affairs or business arrangements between mining investors and saloon girls looking to move up in the world." The ceremony itself was brief and perfunctory. They exchanged simple vows, Garrett having purchased plain gold bands from the town's jeweler that morning. When Justice Parker pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett leaned down to place a chaste kiss on Grace's lips, their first such contact, necessary for appearances but stirring unexpected emotions nonetheless. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Greenwood," Justice Parker said, handing them their marriage certificate. "May your life together be prosperous and blessed with children." Outside, as they walked back toward Main Street, Grace felt oddly changed by the brief ceremony. Legally, she was now Grace Greenwood. The protection of Garrett's name was officially hers, along with all the respectability and security marriage conferred in frontier society. "How do you feel?" Garrett asked quietly. "Safe," she replied honestly. "And grateful." "Good." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining naturally now. "Let's make sure Blackford's men see us today. The more people who know we're officially married, the better." They made a point of visiting several businesses where they'd already introduced themselves, sharing their happy news that they had decided to formalize their union in Pioche, rather than waiting until their business was established. The story was received with congratulations and well wishes, further cementing their place in the community. Late that afternoon, as they shared coffee at the town's bakery, the moment they'd been anticipating finally arrived. The two men they'd identified as Blackford's agents entered, scanning the room before approaching their table. "Afternoon," the taller one said, tipping his hat with false politeness. "Don't believe we've met. Name's Wilson. This here's Daniels. We're representatives of a businessman from Sacramento." Garrett rose partially, offering a handshake with calculated civility. "Garrett Greenwood, my wife Grace." His emphasis on the word wife was subtle but unmistakable. Wilson's eyes lingered on Grace, assessment evident in his gaze. "Pleasure, madam. Don't suppose you've been in town long." "Just arrived a few days ago," Garrett answered before Grace could speak. "Setting up a dry goods business. Perhaps your employer might become a supplier when he learns we're established." "Perhaps." Wilson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, we're looking for someone. Young woman traveling alone. Auburn hair like your wife's, similar build too. Name's Grace Kellerman. Ran off from Sacramento about 2 weeks back. Our employer is most concerned for her welfare." Grace kept her expression pleasantly neutral, though her heart hammered in her chest. "How unfortunate. Is she family?" "Soon to be. She's engaged to our employer but had something of a nervous episode." Daniels spoke for the first time, his tone suggesting concern while his eyes remained cold. "Ran off before the wedding. Doctor says she's not entirely well, mentally speaking." "That's troubling," Garrett commented, his hand finding Grace's on the table, a gesture that appeared supportive to observers but also served to display their wedding bands prominently. "We haven't encountered any single women matching that description, have we, darling?" "No, certainly not." Grace met Wilson's gaze directly, drawing strength from Garrett's presence. "But we've been rather preoccupied with our own affairs. We were just married yesterday, you see." "Congratulations," Wilson replied without warmth. "If you do happen to see or hear anything about Miss Kellerman, there's a substantial reward. We're staying at the Silver Dollar Hotel." "We'll keep that in mind," Garrett assured them. "Though I suspect my wife and I will be quite focused on our new business and home for the foreseeable future." After the men departed, Grace released a shaky breath. "Do you think they believed us? They're suspicious you look too similar to the woman they're seeking for coincidence. But the marriage license and our established presence here creates reasonable doubt." Garrett's eyes followed the men as they moved down the street. "We need to be careful, though. They might still try to confirm your identity." That evening at the boarding house, Martha pulled them aside before dinner. "Those men were here asking questions about you too," she informed them quietly. "Wanted to know when you arrived, if you came together, that sort of thing." Grace's stomach tightened with anxiety, but Garrett remained calm. What did you tell them? That you're one of the most devoted couples I've seen come through my establishment in years, Martha replied with a small smile. And that congratulations were in order on your recent marriage. Thank you, Martha, Grace said sincerely. Don't thank me yet. They asked if I'd seen your marriage license. Her expression grew serious. I said no, but suggested they could verify it with Justice Parker if they had concerns. They're thorough, Garrett commented, his arm tightening around Grace's waist, but we have nothing to hide. Martha studied them for a long moment. No, I don't believe you do, though I suspect there's more to your story than you've shared. She waved off their attempted explanation. No need to elaborate. We all have our reasons for seeking new beginnings in places like Pioche. Whatever yours are, you seem like good people. Her acceptance and tacit support meant more than she could know. Throughout dinner, Grace found herself reflecting on how quickly they had built connections in this frontier town, Martha's protective interest. The shopkeepers who greeted them by name, even the banker who had approved their business loan with minimal questions, thanks to Garrett's substantial deposit. These were the foundations of a real life, not merely a temporary deception. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. What would happen when the danger passed? Could she simply walk away from this community that was beginning to accept her, from this man who had risked everything to protect her? That night in their room, as Garrett prepared his floor palette, Grace made a decision. This is ridiculous, she said suddenly. The bed is large enough for both of us. Garrett straightened, surprise evident in his expression. Grace, that's not necessary. I'm comfortable enough here. You're sleeping on a hard floor when there's a perfectly good bed that can accommodate us both. She met his gaze steadily. We're legally married now, Garrett. Sharing a bed for sleep doesn't violate your promise to respect boundaries. He studied her for a long moment, seemingly weighing her sincerity against his own principles. If you're certain. I am. She moved to one side of the bed, leaving ample space. I trust you completely. With evident reluctance, Garrett abandoned his pallet and settled on the far edge of the bed, maintaining as much distance between them as the mattress allowed. Good night, then. Good night. They lay in tense silence for several minutes, both acutely aware of the other's presence. Gradually, however, the day's exhaustion overcame awkwardness, and Grace drifted into sleep with the comforting knowledge that Garrett was near. The next morning brought a new level of domestic intimacy, waking in the same bed, negotiating the small space as they prepared for the day, the casual brushing of hands as they passed items at breakfast. These small interactions, mundane for a true married couple, carried a heightened significance for them, blurring the line between pretense and reality. Over the following days, they settled into a rhythm. They secured the storefront they had selected, began ordering inventory for their supposed business, and continued to establish themselves as respected new residents of Pioche. Garrett even joined a committee tasked with improving the town's fire prevention measures, while Grace volunteered to help organize the town's upcoming Founders' Day celebration. Throughout it all, Blackford's men remained in town, watching from a distance but making no direct moves. Their presence was a constant reminder of the danger that had brought Grace and Garrett together. Yet paradoxically, it also strengthened the bond between them. Each day of successful deception, each night of chaste but increasingly comfortable proximity, deepened their connection. A week after their legal marriage, they moved from the boarding house to a small but comfortable house on the edge of town, a rental that came with their business lease. The additional privacy allowed them to speak more freely about their situation. "They're growing frustrated," Garrett observed as they shared a simple dinner in their new home. "I overheard Wilson at the saloon yesterday. They've expanded their search to outlying settlements. "Do you think they'll give up soon?" Grace asked hopefully. "Eventually. But men like that hate to fail." He set down his fork, expression serious. "Grace, there's something we need to discuss." "What is it?" "I received a telegram today from a friend in Sacramento. I asked him to make discreet inquiries about Blackford." Garrett hesitated. "It seems your former employer has suffered some setbacks. A business rival has exposed irregular accounting in his operations. The territorial governor, who was among his strongest allies, has distanced himself. Blackford's influence is waning." Hope flared in Grace's heart. "Does that mean I'm safe? That he won't pursue me further? It suggests his resources for hunting you may be limited sooner than we expected." Garrett's expression remained cautious. "But wounded predators can be the most dangerous. We should maintain our vigilance for now." Grace nodded, though disappointment tempered her initial surge of optimism. "Of course, you're right. There's more." Garrett reached across the table, taking her hand. "My friend also learned that Blackford has been implicated in several unsavory activities, including filing false declarations of mental incompetence against 2 other women who refused his advances." "So I wasn't the first," Grace whispered, a chill running through her despite the warm room. "No. But you may be the last. The authorities are investigating him now." Garrett's thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "It may take time, but it seems likely that Blackford will face legal consequences for his actions. When that happens, you'll truly be free." The news should have filled Grace with unmitigated relief. The threat that had driven her into the mountains was diminishing. Soon, perhaps, she could reclaim her own identity without fear. Yet mixed with relief was a new anxiety: what would happen to her marriage of convenience when convenience was no longer necessary? As if reading her thoughts, Garrett continued, "We should discuss what this means for our arrangement." Grace withdrew her hand, suddenly needing distance to think clearly. "Yes, I suppose we should." "The business is doing well," he said, referring to the dry goods store they had successfully opened 2 weeks prior. "Better than I expected, honestly." "You have a gift for organization and customer relations. And you're surprisingly adept at negotiating with suppliers," she replied, appreciative but confused by this turn in the conversation. "What I'm trying to say is that we've built something valuable here. Something that could sustain you even after." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "After our arrangement ends," understanding dawned. "You're saying I could keep the business when we part ways?" Garrett nodded. "It would be a fair settlement. You've contributed equally to its success, despite the initial capital coming from my savings." The generosity of the offer touched Grace deeply, yet it also created an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. After nearly 2 months of living as Garrett's wife, sharing meals, conversations, even sleeping beside him each night, the prospect of continuing in Pioche alone felt strangely empty. "That's very generous," she said carefully. "But what would you do? Return to your cabin in the mountains?" "I've been giving that some thought." Garrett rose from the table, moving to the window that overlooked the town below. "The solitary life suited me once. I'm not certain it would now." The implication hung between them, unspoken but palpable. Their arrangement, begun as a necessary deception, had evolved into something neither had anticipated: a partnership based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and growing affection. "Garrett," Grace began, uncertain how to express the complex emotions swirling within her. These past weeks, a sharp knock at the door interrupted her. They exchanged alarmed glances. It was late for social calls, and few people knew their home's location. "Stay here," Garrett instructed, moving silently to retrieve his revolver from the drawer where he kept it. Grace's heart pounded as he approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called. "Telegram for Mr. Greenwood," came the reply, a boy's voice, young and impatient. Garrett relaxed slightly but kept the revolver hidden as he opened the door. The telegraph operator's young assistant stood on their porch, message in hand. "Sorry for the late hour, sir, but Mr. Jenkins said it was important." Garrett tipped the boy after accepting the telegram, then closed the door and broke the seal. His expression changed as he read, a mixture of surprise and something Grace couldn't identify. "What is it?" she asked, rising from the table. "It's from my friend in Sacramento again." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Joshua Blackford was arrested yesterday. Fraud, intimidation, falsifying medical documents. The governor himself ordered the investigation after similar accusations from multiple women came to light." Relief washed over Grace in a dizzying wave. "Then it's over. He can't threaten me anymore. It appears so." Garrett handed her the telegram. "My friend says Blackford's assets have been frozen pending trial. His men have likely been recalled to Sacramento or have scattered to avoid association with him." Grace read the message, hands trembling slightly. After months of fear and hiding, the sudden prospect of freedom was almost overwhelming. "I can't believe it's really over. Believe it." Garrett's voice was soft but certain. "You're safe now, Grace, truly safe." The realization settled over her gradually. She no longer needed the protection of their marriage, no longer needed to hide behind Garrett's name or depend on his strength to keep Blackford's men at bay. The freedom she had sought when fleeing Sacramento was finally, legitimately hers. Yet instead of joy, she felt a curious hollowness. She looked around the small home they had furnished together, thought of the business they had built, the life they had begun to create in Pioche. All of it had been premised on necessary deception, a means of survival, not a chosen path. Garrett seemed to sense her conflicted emotions. "This changes things," he said quietly. "As I promised from the beginning, you're free to go your own way now. We can begin arrangements for an annulment whenever you're ready." The words, though expected, sent a sharp pain through Grace's heart. "Is that what you want?" she asked before she could stop herself. Garrett stilled, his gray eyes searching hers. "What I want?" He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "What I want hasn't changed since I found you half frozen on that mountain pass, Grace. I wanted you safe then. I want you happy now. That doesn't answer my question." Grace took a step toward him, courage building within her. "Do you want our marriage to end?" The directness of her question seemed to startle him. For a moment, the careful control he always maintained slipped, revealing a depth of emotion he had kept hidden. "No," he said simply. "I don't." The single word, spoken with such raw honesty, shifted something fundamental between them. Grace closed the distance between them, her heart pounding. "Neither do I," she whispered. Garrett's expression transformed surprise, giving way to cautious hope. "Grace, are you certain? Our marriage was never meant to be real. It was protection, a shield against danger." "It began that way," she acknowledged. "But something changed, didn't it? Somewhere between you sharing your coat on that mountain and us building this life together in Pioche." "Yes." His voice was rough with emotion. "Something changed for me. I never expected to feel this way again, to want a partner, a future with someone. But you." He reached out, his fingers gently touching her cheek. "You made me want those things again." Grace leaned into his touch, her eyes holding his. "I was running from a man who wanted to possess me, not love me. I never imagined I'd find someone who would offer protection without demanding anything in return. Who would respect my choices, value my contributions, see me as an equal." "Is that enough, though?" Garrett's expression was serious despite the tenderness in his touch. "A marriage should be more than respect and partnership." In answer, Grace rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to their first real kiss, not performed for appearances or legal necessity but born of genuine desire. For a moment, Garrett remained still, perhaps shocked by her boldness. Then his arms encircled her, drawing her against him as he returned the kiss with a passion that had been restrained for too long. When they finally parted, both breathless, Grace looked up at him with absolute certainty. "I love you, Garrett Greenwood. Not because you saved my life, not because you protected me from Blackford, but because of who you are, a man of honor, of kindness, of unwavering integrity." Joy transformed Garrett's weathered face, erasing years of solitude and carefully maintained distance. "And I love you, Grace Greenwood. Have since somewhere between that mountain pass and Pioche, though I barely dared admit it even to myself." They stood there in the center of their small home, arms entwined, foreheads touching, no longer a couple bound by necessity and deception, but two people who had found unexpected love in the midst of danger and uncertainty. "So what happens now?" Grace asked softly. "Do we simply continue as we are, but for real this time, if that's what you want?" Garrett smiled, his hands warm against her back, though perhaps with fewer nights keeping carefully to opposite sides of the bed. Grace laughed, joy bubbling up from a place inside her she'd thought long closed. "I think I could agree to that amendment of our arrangement, Mr. Greenwood." "In that case, Mrs. Greenwood," he replied, his voice dropping to a tone that sent pleasant shivers down her spine, "perhaps we should retire for the evening." Their first night as a truly married couple erased any remaining boundaries between them, transforming their legal union into something deeply authentic and profound. In Garrett's tender embrace, Grace found healing for past wounds and promise for the future, a future neither had anticipated when he found her freezing on that mountain pass, and declared they would make it together. The following spring brought new beginnings. Their business flourished, becoming a cornerstone of Pioche's commercial district. They expanded to include a section of books and writing supplies after Grace discovered a demand among the mining community's families for educational materials. Garrett's knowledge of the surrounding wilderness made him an ideal supplier of certain frontier necessities, while Grace's bookkeeping skills ensured their operation remained profitable and honest. On a warm April morning, as they walked together along the ridge overlooking Pioche, Garrett brought Grace to a spot where wildflowers carpeted the hillside. "I've been thinking," he said, his arm comfortable around her waist, "about our future. Have you now?" Grace teased, leaning into his embrace. "And what conclusions have you reached, Mr. Greenwood?" "That perhaps it's time to build something permanent." He gestured toward a level section of land just beyond the wildflower meadow. "This plot is for sale. Good water source nearby, excellent view, still close enough to town for convenience." Grace surveyed the location, immediately seeing its potential. "You want to build a home here, our home," he clarified, "a proper one with room to grow." His expression grew soft, a hint of vulnerability showing. "Perhaps even room for children someday, if that's something you might want." The suggestion filled Grace with unexpected longing and joy. "I would like that very much," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "A family of our own." Garrett's smile was radiant. "Then it's settled. We'll build our future here together." That summer, they began construction on their home, a sturdy two-story structure with large windows to capture the magnificent views and ample space for the family they hoped to create. Garrett proved as skilled in building as he was in hunting and trapping, while Grace designed the interior with an eye toward both beauty and practicality. By Christmas, they had moved into their new home, celebrating the holiday with friends from town, including Martha Simmons, who had become something of a surrogate mother to Grace. As they sat before their fireplace on Christmas Eve, Garrett handed Grace a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, surprised by the unexpected gift. "Open it and see," he replied, his expression a mixture of anticipation and tenderness. Inside was a beautiful journal bound in soft leather, with Grace Greenwood embossed on the cover in elegant script. "Turn to the first page," Garrett encouraged. Grace did so, finding a handwritten inscription in Garrett's neat, precise handwriting. "For my beloved wife, who found the courage to leave danger behind and the strength to build something beautiful in its place. May these pages record our journey together from this day forward. With all my love, Garrett." Below the inscription was a pressed flower, a mountain lily, carefully preserved. "I gathered it the day after I found you," Garrett explained, seeing her questioning look. "It was growing somehow despite the snow, just as you were surviving against the odds. I kept it as a reminder of that day." Tears filled Grace's eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered, touching the delicate preserved petals. "Thank you." "I have one more thing to tell you," she said after a moment, taking his hand and placing it gently on her abdomen. "Something that should certainly be recorded in this journal." Garrett's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Grace, are you?" She nodded, joy illuminating her face. "Doctor Harrison confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Garrett. In June." The mixture of awe, joy, and love that transformed his expression was something Grace knew she would remember all her days. He gathered her in his arms, holding her as if she were infinitely precious. "A family," he whispered against her hair. "Our family." As snow fell gently outside their home, Grace reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From a desperate flight through the mountains to a marriage of convenience that had blossomed into the deepest love she had ever known. Their path had been unexpected but ultimately perfect. Their son, Samuel, was born the following June, a robust baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's auburn hair. He was joined 2 years later by a daughter, Elizabeth, named for the love Garrett had lost long ago, a way of healing old wounds while celebrating new joy. As the years passed, their businesses prospered, their family grew, and their bond deepened. The dry goods store expanded to include a second location in a neighboring settlement, managed by a trusted employee. Garrett occasionally guided hunting expeditions or consulted on mining ventures, but increasingly found his greatest satisfaction in home and family. On their 10th anniversary, they returned to the mountain pass, where they had first met, a journey undertaken in summer's warmth rather than winter's peril. Their children, now aged 7 and 5, played among the wildflowers while Garrett and Grace stood at the spot where he had found her half frozen in the snow. "I sometimes wonder," Grace said, her hand warm in his, "what would have happened if you hadn't come along that day? If you hadn't been hunting when the storm hit." "I don't like to think about that possibility," Garrett replied, drawing her closer, "though I suspect you would have found a way to survive. You're stronger than you know, Grace Greenwood." "Perhaps," she conceded. "But I'm glad I didn't have to find out." She looked up at him, love evident in her expression. "Do you remember what you said to me that day? After you gave me your coat, 'We'll make it together,'" Garrett recalled, his voice soft with memory. "And we have, haven't we?" Grace turned to watch their children chasing butterflies in the summer sunshine, Samuel with his father's quiet confidence, Elizabeth with her mother's curious spirit. "We've made something beautiful together." Garrett followed her gaze, his arm tightening around her waist. "More than I ever dared hope for," he agreed, "and we're only just beginning." As the mountain breeze rustled through the pines, carrying the scent of summer flowers, Grace leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, grateful beyond words for the storm that had driven her to this pass, for the cowboy who had shared his coat, and for the journey they had undertaken together, a journey of protection that had become partnership, of necessity that had transformed into the deepest love. They had indeed made it together, and they would continue to do so for all the days to come.